At the end of World War II, many of the Axis forces comprising Nazi Germany, Italy, and Imperial Japan were taken to trial to be prosecuted for war crimes. Meanwhile, the Allied forces comprising the US, UK, France, and China were hailed as the heirs. Now, during the trials, especially the famous Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, the world got first-hand accounts of the atrocious and inhumane acts committed by the Axis during the war. But as they say, history is written by the victors, which is why the tribunals conveniently forgot that the Allied forces were also perpetrators of atrocious war crimes. Till today, most of these crimes have never been prosecuted.
Welcome to the Unveiled History.
Between 1896 and 1924, about 200,000 Japanese migrated from Japan to the islands of Hawaii, and out of all these numbers, 180,000 eventually settled in the west coast, setting up farms and small businesses. However, European Americans living on the west coast began to feel threatened and lobbied to restrict the citizenship rights of Japanese immigrants. This led to the Immigration Act of 1924, which effectively banned all immigration from Japan. As a result, all Japanese born after 1924 were automatically by law considered US citizens. However, in the 1930s, as the military might of Imperial Japan began to rise, the Office of the Naval Intelligence began to monitor Japanese Americans in Hawaii. Specifically, at the order of President Roosevelt, the ONI began to compile a list of some Japanese Americans who would be placed in a concentration camp in the event of trouble. Trouble came after the Pearl Harbor attack, which officially brought the US into the war. A few weeks following the attack, Japanese Americans who had been deemed loyal after a series of investigations were forcibly uprooted from their homes and sent to concentration camps. About 120,000 Japanese Americans were sent to 10 different concentration camps. According to the US government at the time, the internment was necessary to mitigate the risks supposedly posed by the Japanese. The Japanese internees were prohibited from taking more than they could carry into the camps. So, most of them were forced to sell their properties, including homes and businesses. Most of the camps were located on Native American reservations. And, though not compared to Nazi Germany camps, the conditions in the camps were terrible. The rooms were overcrowded with as many as 25 people living in one room. The internees were given a budget of 45 cents daily per capita for food rations. Armed guards regularly patrolled the camps and there were cases of undocumented shootings. The terrible living conditions and the inadequate medical assistance resulted in the death of over 1,000 people across the 10 camps. Although the Japanese Americans were eventually shut down in 1945 following an executive order issued in 1944 by the Supreme Court, the fact remains that their internment was unconstitutional and constituted as a war crime. In 1940, Germany launched an attack on France, which was largely successful. The French forces were battered and tired and decided to surrender to Germany. France's ally, the British, agreed on the condition that the French naval fleet did not fall into the hands of the Germans and sailed for British harbours. France assured the British that the French fleet would never fall into the hands of the Germans. However, the British under the leadership of Winston Churchill were not convinced that France could keep its fleet from the Germans. So, Churchill made a drastic decision. It was called Operation Catapult, and the mission was to destroy the French fleet moored at Mers el-Kebir near Oran in Algeria. The fleet included 2 modern battle cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 older battleships, and a seaplane carrier. On July 3rd, 1940, Force H, a battalion of the British Royal Navy, arrived at Mers el-Kebir and gave the commander of the French fleet an ultimatum. The French commander resisted, and by 6 PM on that day, the British opened fire. The British Royal Navy ships were on open water so they could easily manoeuvre. However, the French fleet could not do this as it was in a confined space. Operation Catapult was a success. The French fleet did not fall into the hands of the Germans. However, over 1,000 men who had fought with the British had been killed by the British. The operation was widely condemned by France and led to a breakdown in diplomatic ties with the British. France also retaliated by bombing Gibraltar and exchanging fire several times with British ships. However, despite this ruthlessness exhibited by the British, Operation Catapult has been regarded as the determination of the British to fight on. The Second Hague Convention of 1907 clearly banned the killing of shipwreck survivors under any circumstances. However, despite the fact that Britain was part of the countries that signed the convention, records show that on several occasions the British forces ignored this rule and killed shipwreck survivors. In July 1941, the submarine HMS Torbay, which was under the command of Anthony Mears, was stationed in the Mediterranean waters. According to the reports, Mears occasionally sank German ships and openly killed the survivors, despite the fact that none of the survivors posed a threat to Mears and his crew. One such incident occurred in March 1942, when Mears sank an Italian ship. After sinking the ship, he ordered his men to open fire on the survivors. Interestingly, Mears didn't feel bad about his actions. In fact, he was proud about it and reported it in his official logbook. The only punishment he received from his supervisors was a reprimand. In September 1942, an Italian hospital ship Arno was torpedoed and sunk by RAF torpedo bombers northeast of Ras El Tin, near Tobruk. According to the British, they had received a decoded German radio message that indicated that the vessel was carrying supplies to Axis troops. A similar incident occurred in 1944 when the German hospital ship Tübingen was sunk by two Beaufighter bombers off Pola in the Adriatic Sea. According to scholars like Alfred Zayers, the sinking of hospital ships and the killing of shipwreck survivors constitute as war crimes. Sadly, all Allied militaries, including the British, France, US and Canada, were guilty of rape and sexual harassment. Between September 1943 and December 1945, Italian statistics recorded 8 rapes and 19 attempted rapes by British soldiers. In 1943, during the invasion of Sicily, evidence from Belgian reporters revealed that rape and sexual harassment by British troops occurred frequently. In Germany, British and Canadian forces occasionally sexually harassed and raped local women, including the elderly. Some of these incidents were committed under the effects of alcohol or post-traumatic stress, but there were also cases of premeditated attacks. One such case was the rape of 3 German women on a single day in April 1945. Another case was the attempted rape of 2 local girls at gunpoint in the village of Oil. The US forces were responsible for over 11,000 rapes, while the French forces were accused of over 1,500. However, the most atrocious rape incidents were those committed by the Soviets. According to reports, the Soviet army was responsible for the rape of up to 2 million women and children, as well as the subsequent death of 240,000. Now, called the largest mass rape in history, the Soviets violated women and children from East Prussia and Pomerania. Many of these women were assaulted up to 100 times, and often could not resist in the face of overwhelming Soviet numbers. According to historians, these atrocities were driven by the lust for revenge. However, in the case of the Soviets, it was simply because the Soviets saw themselves as conquerors, not liberators. Interrogations of prisoners of war were a normal part of World War II. However, the UK took the interrogations to another level, which was deemed a war crime. In 1940, the UK established a cage in each command area of the United Kingdom. The purpose of these cages was the interrogation of prisoners of war. 9 cages were established from southern England to Scotland, with the London cage being the headquarters after the war. The interrogations were not just mere question and answer sessions. Everything from starvation and sleep deprivation to brutal beatings was practiced within its walls, to extract information and, in some cases, confessions. According to the account of Alexander Scotland, the methods used to elicit confessions violated the 1929 Geneva Convention. There were instances of prisoners being forced to kill while being beaten about the head, forced to stand to attention for up to 26 hours, and threatened with execution and an unnecessary operation. Despite the fact that this was undeniably a war crime, no participants were ever prosecuted. The British government, for the most part, turned a blind eye to the abuse despite multiple complaints from various parties. They argued that it was justifiable given the situation. While the crimes and atrocities committed by the Allied forces cannot be compared to those of the Axis, it doesn't change the fact that a crime was still committed, and most of them were not prosecuted.